Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And this video follows on from my previous video on Whitehall Palace. If you haven't seen that one yet, you might want to check it out first because it does lay out the context for the topic that we are looking at today. So I will be sure to leave that video linked in a card. Today's video explores the banqueting house of Whitehall Palace, which survived that devastating fire of the 4th of January 1698. The particular focus of this video is, however, the building itself. Commissioned and built as an entertainment space for James VI of Scots and 1st of England, and I will especially be looking at how it became the venue for regicide. On the 30th of January 1649, when the 48-year-old Charles Stuart was beheaded for treason before a gathered crowd in front of his own father's banqueting house. With that, monarchical rule was brought to an end. The nation was now a republic, and it would remain so until the restoration of the monarchy in the person of Charles Stuart's son, Charles II, in 1660. As I mentioned in my previous video, the banqueting house of King James was part of the complex of Whitehall Palace, which was itself ideally positioned to be as close as possible to the very heart of government, both then and now, the building of the Palace of Westminster. Both Whitehall and Westminster would be key locations for the many events in the story of the fall and destruction of King Charles I. As I discussed in my earlier video, I will be looking at Charles's point of no return, as I see it, in a future video. But today, we're at Endgame, looking at Charles's final days and his execution. On the 19th of January 1649, Charles was brought back to London. He had been held at Windsor Castle from 2 days before the preceding Christmas. On the next day, the 20th of January 1649, Charles was taken from St James's Palace to Westminster Hall to stand trial before 159 commissioners who had been selected for the purpose. Mark A. Kishlansky and John Morrill described the trial as follows. Charles then had his finest hour. He mocked his judges. He defied them to say by what authority they sought to try their lawful king. He scorned the claims of the Commons to be a judicature, or to have the authority to establish a judicature. He made the manifest injustice to him an emblem of the injustice all his subjects could expect from this fraction of a parliament. For 3 days running, he scorned the court and refused to enter a plea. John Bradshaw, the obscure provincial judge who was the highest-ranking judicial officer the Commons could persuade to preside over the trial, could do little but bluster in response, and many of the commissioners skulked away. Despite the lack of a plea, the trial continued, and witnesses were heard. A judgment was reached and attested to by 59 commissioners, barely 1 in 3 of those appointed to serve, and a sentence was passed. The Rump, which is the parliament that remained after Pride's purge of December 1648, and the army had wanted a trial process that was open and that vindicated their actions. It turned into a nightmare, and Bradshaw's refusal to allow the king to speak after his conviction was the final suggestion of the show trial. Charles had been convicted of high treason for levying and maintaining war against the Parliament and people. He was condemned and he would be executed. Charles had just 3 days to live. He spent the night after his sentencing at Whitehall Palace. He was removed the next day to the nearby St James's Palace. On the 29th of January 1649, 2 of Charles's children, the 13-year-old Elizabeth and the 9-year-old Henry, Duke of Gloucester, were brought to say a final farewell to their father. These children were being held by Charles's enemies, the parliamentarians. I'd like to now read some of the collected accounts of this meeting between Charles and his children. His children being come to meet him, he first gave his blessing to the Lady Elizabeth, and bade her remember to tell her brother James, whenever she should see him, that it was his father's last desire that he should no more look upon Charles as his eldest brother only, but be obedient unto him as his sovereign, and that they should love one another, and forgive their father's enemies. Then said the king to her, "Sweetheart, you will forget this." "No," said she, "I shall never forget it whilst I live." And pouring forth abundance of tears, promised him to write down the particulars. Then the king, taking the Duke of Gloucester upon his knee, said, "Sweetheart, now they will cut off thy father's head." Upon which words the child looked very steadfastly upon him. "Mark, child, what I say. They will cut off my head, and perhaps make thee a king. But mark what I say. You must not be a king so long as your brothers Charles and James do live. For they will cut off your brothers' heads when they can catch them, and cut off thy head too at last, and therefore I charge you, do not be made a king by them." At which the child, sighing, said, "I will be torn in pieces first." Which, falling so unexpectedly from one so young, it made the king rejoice exceedingly. Another relation from the Lady Elizabeth's own hand. What the king said to me the 29th of January 1648, being the last time I had the happiness to see him. He told me he was glad I was come, and although he had not time to say much, yet what he had to say to me, which he had not to another, or leave in writing, because he feared their cruelty was such as they would not have permitted him to write to me. He wished me not to grieve and torment myself for him, for that would be a glorious death that he should die, it being for the laws and liberties of this land, and for maintaining the true Protestant religion. He bid me read Bishop Andrews's sermons, Hooker's Ecclesiastical Polity, and Bishop Laud's book against Fisher, which would ground me against popery. He told me he had forgiven all his enemies, and hoped God would forgive them also, and commanded us and all the rest of my brothers and sisters to forgive them. He bid me tell my mother that his thoughts had never strayed from her, and that his love should be the same to the last. Withal, he commanded me and my brother to be obedient to her, and bid me send his blessings to the rest of my brothers and sisters, with commendation to all his friends. So, after he had given me his blessing, I took my leave. Further, he commanded us all to forgive those people, but never to trust them, for they had been most false to him and those that gave them power, and he feared also to their own souls. And he desired me not to grieve for him, for he should die a martyr, and that he doubted not but the Lord would settle his throne upon his son, and that we should be all happier than we could have expected to have been if he had lived, with many other things which at present I cannot remember. Another relation from the Lady Elizabeth. The king said to the Duke of Gloucester that he would say nothing to him but what was for the good of his soul, and he told him that he heard the army intended to make him king, but it was a thing not for him to take upon him, if he regarded the welfare of his soul, for he had 2 brothers before him, and therefore commanded him upon his blessing never to accept it, unless it redounded lawfully upon him, and commanded him to fear the Lord, and he would provide for him. Charles Stuart, or as we know him better of course, King Charles I, was many things, and I will leave for a future video his particular character flaws, shall we say, that I think contributed to his downfall. Because today, and in particular in regard to those accounts that I've just read, what I think is most important to remember is that according to all of the records, Charles I was a loving husband and a loving father. He loved his children and they loved him. And that makes what must have happened when he had to say goodbye to just two of them particularly painful for all concerned. The day after Charles had said those goodbyes to two of his children was Tuesday, the 30th of January. It was a bitterly cold day. Charles got up early, and he was determined to dress for the weather. It seems he was concerned that he would leave a good impression on the crowd that was about to gather to watch him die. So he dressed warmly, in order to avoid any potential shivering from the cold being misconstrued as his cowardice. He spent time in prayer before he was escorted under guard back to Whitehall. He was left to wait in his bedchamber until it was time for him to go to the scaffold, the block, and his death. When that time came, he was led through the banqueting house that had been commissioned by his father. As I've already said, this is the building that remains as the largest part of the destroyed Palace of Whitehall to survive. The jewel in the crown of this magnificent survivor is, at least as far as I'm concerned, its painted ceiling. It is made up of elaborately gilded carvings which frame 9 beautiful canvases by Sir Peter Paul Rubens and his studio. The banqueting house may have been James's, but the ceiling was his son's. Believed to have been commissioned by King Charles I in 1629 or 1630, the canvases were installed in 1636. According to the team at Historic Royal Palaces, who are the custodians of the banqueting house, this installation would not be easy. This comes from the HRP website on the ceiling. When the canvases were first unrolled on the floor, Inigo Jones and Rubens' assistants realised with mounting horror they were too big to fit in the ceiling. Although both Belgium and England measured in feet and inches, each country used a different length for a foot. Drastic moderations had to be made on site to make them fit. On either side of the length of the room, there are 2 long canvases, both of which are entitled and depict a procession of cherubs. At the 4 corners of the room, affirming defeats are presented. We see abundance, also known as royal bounty, defeating avarice. Another corner has reason, or moderation and the power of wise government, defeating intemperate discord. Next, heroic virtue, which is presented in the form of Hercules, defeats envy. And wisdom, finally, as personified by the goddess Minerva, defeats ignorance. Running down the centre of the ceiling, there are 3 larger canvases. At one end is the wise rule of James I. Charles's father sits enthroned above a scene of chaos and war. Minerva, goddess of wisdom, is defending James and the throne from an assault from Mars, the god of war. Beside the king, peace and plenty embrace. The royal crown is held by a cherub. Above, winged victories descend. They prepare to crown James with the laurel wreath of triumph. The canvas that has been installed at the other end of the ceiling depicts the union of the crowns of England and Scotland. Minerva, goddess of wisdom, appears once again. She is shown being instructed by James, who sits enthroned, holding his orb and sceptre. He is instructing Minerva to join the crowns of his 2 kingdoms. The 2 women represent England and Scotland. Between them is a naked child. This is the newborn union. The cherubs flying overhead hold aloft the joined arms of the kingdoms that have been brought together through the Stuart monarchs, beginning, of course, with James. In the middle of the ceiling, taking pride of place as the largest canvas, sits the apotheosis of James I. This is the artistic representation of James's ascent into heaven. James is shown with one foot on the wing of an eagle, the other on a globe. Figures representing religion and scriptural truth, with flaming urn and book respectively, are placed beside him. Cherubs fly away with his crown, orb and sceptre. These are, of course, symbols of his earthly throne and majesty, and what awaits him is something infinitely better. The figure of justice, appropriately shown holding scales, is taking James's arm to raise him up to heaven. This is being presented as his just reward for his deeds as an earthly king. Other cherubs and flying figures, including the winged figure of victory, await him, and they hold a laurel wreath of triumph, as well as the staff of Hermes. This is one of the symbols of the messenger god Mercury, the figure who acts as the conductor of the dead in classical mythology. As the Royal Collection Trust website explains, the series can be collectively titled The Glorification of King James I. I believe it acts as a visual manifesto that supports not only the Stuart monarchy, but also their claim to divine right rule. This claim was one of a myriad of things that I believe contributed to all of the troubles that Charles would encounter during his life and reign. Of course, he couldn't possibly have known when he was commissioning or having this artwork installed that he would be walking to his execution beneath this ceiling and these canvases. But I do wonder what he might have thought had he looked up at them. Do you think it would have challenged or perhaps even affirmed his belief in the divinity of his own personal rule, which he thought he shared with his father, that figure being raised up to heaven in the apotheosis? Perhaps we might find evidence or influence for an answer for these questions by looking at some of the words that Charles is reported to have spoken on his scaffold. And I will leave a link to the full report of what he is supposed to have said in the description box. But among his words, he is believed to have said the following: "I have a good cause, and a gracious God on my side." He is also quoted as saying, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." I believe that Charles I viewed himself as a martyr, and it certainly seems that at least some people agreed with him. I'm speaking in particular of those who involved themselves with the publication of this, the Icon Basilica, a text which purports to be an autobiography, which is subtitled "The Portraiture of His Sacred Majesty in His Solitudes and Sufferings." The text was first published 10 days after the execution, on the 9th of February, 1649. It came with this frontispiece, which was engraved by William Marshall. The image is rich with allegory, but here are the key takeaways, at least as far as I'm concerned. Charles is shown kneeling, as if in prayer. On the floor in front of him lies the crown discarded. The word vanity has been engraved on the inside of its rim. Above it, a scroll informs the viewer that this crown is splendid and grave. Charles has taken up in his hands the martyr's crown of thorns. This crown encircles the word grace, and above it, that scroll reads bitter and slight. We are also shown the path of Charles's gaze. He looks towards heaven and the blessed and eternal glory of a heavenly crown. I think the messaging of this image is fairly clear, at least to me. Through his execution, Charles undergoes a transformation, something perhaps similar to that which is shown happening to his father in that apotheosis image that sits in the centre of the banqueting hall ceiling. Charles moves from being a king to being a martyr, and eventually, like his father, ends up with an eternal heavenly crown. But what do you think? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversation in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can come and find me over on my social media. I'll leave links to my Twitter and Instagram in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to this channel. And while I think of it, perhaps you should check that you are subscribed if you want to be, and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you without you wanting to be unsubscribed. While you're there, checking and/or subscribing, why not also hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. Hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.